Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. We have another great repair video here today. So we have an Piaggio Sport City 150 two-stroke in the shop, and the customer has stated that it stopped. The engine cut out while he was riding, it rolled to a stop, and then he wasn't able to get it restarted for about 10 minutes. When it did, it only rode a couple hundred meters and it stopped again. So it's going to sound pretty characteristic of a seized piston, but we're going to get straight into the bike on this one and have a look at some of the other common issues that the Sport City ones can develop and try and diagnose what's going on so we can fix it. Alright, I've skipped a couple of steps, but essentially it's definitely a seized piston. I've had a look through the exhaust port. The piston's very dry and it's full of score marks. I can see that the rings are stuck inside the ring slots in the piston, so it's definitely lost compression because it's had a seizure. It's got some big scores up and down the piston right over the exhaust port. Now, I've skipped a couple of steps and done a bit more diagnosis. I've pulled the oil line off the carby. It looks like, it's hard to tell because the oil lines are quite old and they're not as transparent as they are when they're new. They sort of go yellow, but it looks as though there's some air bubbles in the main line coming from the oil tank to the oil pump, which is very characteristic of the bike running out of oil, because realistically it just needs a bubble of air to make it to the oil pump. And then it's just going to be pumping air because that pump is designed to pump liquid, not air. So if air gets in there, it's not going to pump. The other thing I've done, just to be sure, because as I said, those oil lines are sort of a bit opaque, it's not very easy to see through them. Just to sort of tick all the boxes, I've pulled the transmission cover off and pulled the variator off. Because the bike has so many Ks, I just wanted to make sure that the oil pump belt definitely hasn't failed. Now I think I've seen an oil pump belt snap maybe once ever. But just because this bike has such high Ks, and those belts are supposed to be changed every 10,000 Ks in the Piaggio engine. If you're unfamiliar, the Piaggio engine oil pump runs off a very small belt just behind the variator that runs directly off the crank to a small gear on the oil pump itself, and that's what pumps the oil. So if that belt breaks, you've got no oil. So the belt is still intact, it's fine. So the oil tank is completely full to the brim, so I'm fairly suspicious that what has happened is the bike's run out of oil. The customer has tried to fix it at home, and they've filled the oil tank up all the way to the brim, thinking that maybe perhaps that would solve the issue. But if you're familiar with two-strokes, once that oil pump runs out, or once the oil runs out and the piston goes dry, that's it. The damage is done, and it's going to need a new piston now. So I'm going to start disassembling the shroud around the cylinder. With the Sport City in particular, just with the shape of the frame, we've experienced before that it's very difficult to get the cylinder off and the new piston back in with the engine in the bike. The frame really gets in the way. So a little trick that we've worked out over the years is to put a small jack underneath the frame of the scooter, and then undo the engine mount bolt, just so we can slip the engine back a little bit. Not enough that you need to disconnect any electrics or fuel lines or anything like that. It realistically just needs to slip back maybe 5 or 10 centimeters, and that gives you just enough space to get the cylinder off, and particularly getting the circlip in gives you a bit more space to comfortably get the circlip in without having to muck around with it for ages because of a confined space. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. As I mentioned about the bike needing to drop the engine back, now a little trick that we've used over the years, you see I've got the front of the bike actually strapped down here. Now the reason that we do this, have a look down here. Now the center stand on pretty much all the Piaggio engine bikes, the center stand's actually attached to the engine. So if I drop this bolt here, which is what I'm going to do, that's the engine mount bolt that attaches to the cradle, and then the cradle attaches to the chassis. If I go ahead and drop that, the chassis is just going to fall straight down. So what we actually do, we use a jack. It's an old jack we have laying around. You can use like a MX stand or even some blocks of wood or whatever's going to work. You just want to get something up on that cradle or on the chassis just to hold the chassis up. Now, because there's quite a bit of bike behind the engine, what you don't want to happen is for the bike to still tilt back as soon as you drop that back. So that's why we've strapped the steering down to the bench. So basically we can drop this bolt and the bike's not going to fall over and move. We can slide the engine back and get to the cylinder without having to completely remove the engine or have anything fall over and get damaged. Okay, well this is a first. I was popping the engine back and I actually accidentally knocked the oil line off the bottom of the tank. This is the oil tank here. And what has come out of it is water. The oil tank's completely full of water. So that's definitely a first. I have never seen that before. Water's gotten in here somehow. I would guess because there's no cap, it's somehow worked its way under. And it's gone into the oil tank, and it's immediately gone to the bottom of the tank. And so instead of pumping oil, we've got a water pump, essentially pumping water into the engine instead of fuel. And that's definitely going to explain why it seized, and why it's so dry inside the carby. And even the piston, when I had a look up, it's so dry because we've got water in our egg, and some of the oil's starting to come out now. So what I'm going to do, I've got the oil tank draining. Obviously, we've sort of gotten all the water out now, and we're just draining oil at this point. So I'm just going to, just to be safe, completely drain the tank and replace it with fresh oil. And I'm going to have to prime the oil pump too, because I pulled the oil pump line off, and I don't know if you can see it there, but that's a little bubble of water right up the top. That's literally water in the pump. So the pump's no doubt full of water, and no doubt to cause the seizure, it's pumped water all the way up through this line as well, up into the engine. That oil tank's going to take a little while to drain, so I'm going to go ahead and move back to the cylinder to replacing our piston, and then hopefully by the time I finish that, the oil pump's drained, the oil tank's drained, sorry, and we can start addressing the oil pump and get this thing back to a running state. I said it before, but the access on these is such a pain. Often to get these two screws here out, because on the Piaggios they're just a Phillips head. Now if they're a bit old, which these ones obviously are, a bit rusty, they can often get jammed. So what I would usually do is sit a big fat screwdriver in there, and just give the end of it a bit of a tap with a hammer. You're not trying to bust through the engine, so it just needs to be a light tap. But they were pretty seized on there, so I just gave it a bit of a tap, and they did come free. All right, got all our head nuts out. Head off. All right, let's have a look at this piston, shall we? Yep, there we go. Big C's. Now this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the oil tank here. See how the cylinder doesn't want to come out. So even with the engine drop back, it's still annoying. So what I'm going to do, you can sort of see it's only just clipping the top. So I'm going to lift the back of the wheel up, which will angle the front of the engine down a little bit, and I should be able to slide that cylinder back. It's going to be a little bit awkward to do, so I'm probably not going to film that, but I will catch back up after I've done that. Check that out. Toast. Now this here, that's water. There's that water all over the piston, which completely explains why it's seized. But look, it just goes to show, so this bike was missing the oil cap. All of this has happened because the oil cap wasn't plugged. So it's just filled up with water, and it's caused a piston seizure. It's going to cost this guy, probably a few $100s for this fix, all because there was no oil tank cap. This shows you how quickly something so simple and cheap can turn into something a lot more expensive if you don't address it. Okay, now as always, safe way, chuck a rag down inside the ports when you're either removing or installing the circlip. Now I've said this a million times before, but the reason is if that circlip springs off, which they have a bad habit of doing, you don't want it going into the crank casing, because that's going to be really difficult to get out if that happens. So I've sat the rag in there. Hopefully you can still see the circlip. Just going to get my flat blade in there. I'm going to try my best to do this and be able to show you, but it might be a bit difficult to film it. There we go. There we go. You actually heard it get a little bit springy there. They love to jump away, these things. All right. Just going to push the gudgeon pin out. There we go. These can sometimes get a little bit stuck, especially if they had a bad seize. All right, cylinder and piston out. Now it's a bit of a shame really, because this is, you can actually see the marking inside here. It's a genuine Piaggio piston, and it really doesn't look very old. It actually looks to be in great condition, except for the giant C's directly over the exhaust port. Yeah, and over the intake ports. So, big C's. Now you can actually sort of see why a seizure causes the bike to stop, causes it to lack compression. This is a really great example of that. You can actually see that bottom ring is stuck inside there. So as the piston has started to melt, which is essentially what these score marks are, bits of molten piston have gone into the ring slots and basically welded the ring, friction welded the ring into place. So now the ring actually can't apply any pressure against the side of the cylinder in that spot there. Now the rest of the ring's pretty okay, but because it's not able to apply pressure to the cylinder on that side there, and also the fact that because it's removed some of this material, you've now got two surfaces that don't meet quite as nicely along the piston here. But primarily that ring being jammed in there, that's allowing gases to escape down the side, which is reducing the compression, and it's just obviously reduced it to a point after a few starts, after the initial seizure, that now it's not actually producing enough compression to run. And it's absolutely perfect example of why a seizure, oh, I just popped it out, why a seizure causes a loss of compression. Now that I've popped that out, if I would put that back on the bike and try and run it, it'd probably run for a little bit, but it will just keep seizing because the damage has been done to this piston. So we're going to have to go ahead and replace that. Same with the cylinder here. The cylinder's actually in pretty good shape. We'll have to give it a bit of a hone, but there's a reason why they make these cylinders out of cast iron, the factory ones, and they make the piston out of aluminium, because in a battle between aluminium and cast iron, the cast iron is going to win every time. So the idea is that the cylinder stays good and the piston gets damaged as a sacrificial part, so that you only have to replace the piston, and unless you've had some sort of major mechanical failure like a circlip slipping out or a small end bearing exploding. Aside from that, you generally don't have to replace the cylinder. You just give it a quick hone, which just cleans it up, removes those scores and scratch marks, and then we can just replace the piston and get this thing back on the road. That's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to give this a hone in our parts washer and have our brand new piston kit here. Brand new Piaggio piston. Obviously the arrow, if you can see that always goes to the exhaust side. New gudgeon pin, got a couple of circlips here. Now these types here are actually the E circlips. So if I can show you, sort of make it make sense. Okay, so you see they call them an E circlip because they look like an E, obviously, rather than a C circlip. Now I really much prefer putting these in. The primary reason being, a C circlip doesn't have that little inner tag, so it can be a bit of a pain to get in the piston. These ones here with this extra little tag allow you to get a set of pliers on there, and when you're putting it into the piston, it's much easier to get in because you have much more purchase on this little tag in here than you would otherwise if you didn't have it there. Heaps easier. And we've got our rings here as well. Now I mentioned this in a couple other videos, but I'll mention it again here. With your pistons and your rings, with 50cc scooters you really have two types as it pertains to the rings. So you'll see the ring pin here. The ring pin, hopefully you can see that. Yep. The ring pin isn't in the center of the ring slot. It's slightly offset to the top, and the same is true with the bottom ring. Now if we have a look at, ring slot, sorry. Now if you actually have a look at the rings, you'll see there's a little cutout on one side of the ring, not in the center. So some rings, the ring pin will be in the center of the ring slot, and that little cutout will be on the inside of the ring, so that the ring pin can sit inside the ring. These ones, they offset. So this is the offset type. Now the reason I mention this is because when you put the ring on the piston, you must put the ring the right way. You cannot put it upside down or it won't work. So obviously you'll see here, the ring needs to go that way so that the little cutout lines up with the ring pin. If you put it in upside down, the ring's not going to sit into the slot properly, and you're not going to be able to get the piston into the cylinder. Very, very important. Now, one more thing. Some rings, or some piston kits, for instance the 𝐂𝐤 Vibe that we did recently, the piston kit or the replacement piston kit that we used, there was two different, the rings were both different. One was thicker than the other. So you see this one here as a good test. That ring sits in both of those ring slots relatively nicely, as does this one. So with the Piaggios, generally both rings are the same thickness. If you're rebuilding another bike, sometimes one ring is actually thicker than the other, and so you need to double check before you try and put them in which ring is thicker, and make sure you put the thicker ring in the thicker ring slot. Not the case with this one, but I just thought I'd mention it. So I've got our cylinder here in our parts washer. These honing stones, we actually sell these on our website. These are a great little kit. You can just attach them to a drill, which is exactly what we do. So I'm just going to dip that in our parts washer fluid. You want to gently insert the honing stones into the cylinder. Now, you're not trying to sit here for half an hour doing this. Really, five minutes maximum is how long it should take. Realistically, you're probably not going to get the cylinder absolutely perfect as though nothing ever happens. Nothing ever happened. You're just trying to reduce those scores down just so they're not deep, and so they're not going to be potential cause for problems later. Just trying to give it a bit of a clean up, really. So what we're going to do, we're going to rotate the drill as such, up and down. Now what you don't want is for the honing stones to come out so far that they pop out like that. We want them to stay in. So you really only need to come up about that far, just so we're getting all the way to the top of the cylinder. And the same is true for the bottom. You don't want them to pop too far out of this skirt here, because exactly the same thing will happen, and you'll either break the honing stones or damage the cylinder. So we're just going to sit here. You don't need to go crazy fast. Just take your time. Just a battery drill is fine. You don't need a big, powerful power drill or anything crazy. We're just working our way up and down, and that's just going to clean the cylinder walls so that when we put our new piston in there, everything's nice, a nice smooth surface to mate to, so we don't give ourselves any unnecessary drama. Now, I'm going to spend probably a good 5 minutes doing this, which is going to be really boring for me to sit here and show that. So I'm going to catch you back up once we're finished, and I'll show you what the cylinder looks like once it's been honed and all cleaned up. There we go. So that's really all we're looking for. You just see the inside of the cylinder is pretty nice and clean now. You see there's still a couple little baby marks sort of up here and up the top, but I'm really not too worried about them. You can barely even get your fingernail in them, so that's well and truly fine. That. Ready to assemble our piston and cylinder. So as always, we've always recommended you must assemble your cylinder and piston with 2-stroke oil. So I have a little 2-stroke oil pump. What I usually use, I just use the packet from the piston, and I just chuck a little bit of oil in that. You don't need a lot, just a little dribble like that. All right. We can put this to the side. And you're going to get a little bit messy doing this, so don't wear your good clothes. All right. Chuck a bit of oil inside the cylinder. Now, as always, you're not trying to, fill the cylinder with oil. You're just trying to make sure that nothing's dry. If you put tons and tons of oil in this when you're putting it together, you're just going to create yourself some problems for later. You're going to foul your first spark plug when you've got to put the bike together. Now, before we put the rings in, I usually try and get a bit of oil in the ring slots, because it can be a bit more difficult to do it after the fact. I'm going to put a bit of oil on our rings as well. Okay, there we go. All right. Now, as I mentioned before, these rings just need to go into the correct orientation. Doesn't need to be any particular ring on the top or bottom. So usually I'll try and get the bottom ring in first, just so I'm not having to jump over it when I do a top ring. Let's work it down. Now, they'll often sometimes get caught in here. Just going to gently, without scoring the piston, try and work that ring over. There we go. There we go, sitting in nice. Now, whether you want to put the top or the bottom ring in first, that's just a preference thing. I know Ray, our mechanic, he usually puts the top ring in first and then sort of uses that to jump the bottom ring over it. It's just a preference thing. I don't really like doing it that way. He does, but whatever works for you. There we go. Okay, rings are sitting in there nice. They're moving nicely. There's the cutout sitting right on the ring pin. Perfect. So it's going to chuck a little bit more oil around. And another really important thing we're going to do is we're going to chuck a little bit of oil inside the gudgeon slots, inside and out. Now, the reason for that is the gudgeon pin is often a bit of a pain to get in when it's dry. Now, this one's pretty easy. This one's actually not bad at all. But I just want to make sure that everything's nice and lubed, because the last thing you want to do is put it together and you're stuck inside the confines of the engine and inside the chassis, the frame. Obviously, it's not as nice and open as when you're doing this out here, and something gets jammed up and you're stuck there for 20 minutes and it's really frustrating and you start to get cranky. because it's not the mindset that you want to be in when you're putting something as delicate as an engine together. Okay, so the next important thing we're going to do, now we've got everything looped up, we've got our piston assembled, pretty much. I'm going to work out which side which side circlip we're going to put in first. Now, usually we'll put one circlip in the piston when it's outside of the bike. That way we only have to put one circlip in when we're in, again, that confines of that tight little space in the engine, just to make it easier on yourself, because there's no point making things harder if they don't need to be. So on the Piaggio engine, and to be honest with most scooters, the exhaust side is the easier side, the better access side when you're trying to put the circlip in the bike. So what we'll normally do is put the Variator side circlip in before we put the piston and the cylinder in the bike. It just makes it a lot easier when you're trying to work in that small space. So obviously the cylinder orientates this way, exhaust down. We're going to find our arrow on the piston, which is just here. So the arrow is going to go down towards the exhaust. Now that means that when this is in the bike, this is the Variator side here. So that's the circlip we're going to put in. Very important that you work out using the arrow which side is which, because if you put the circlip in, realize it's the wrong one, then you have to pull it all back apart again. There's a good chance you're going to damage the circlip. Now, putting the circlip in is one of these things. It's again a preference thing. I personally find with these E-clips that the bent needle nose pliers are the easiest way, but it's really just about whatever you find the easiest. Hopefully you can get a good view of this. It's a little bit tricky. Okay, so I've got the end in, and I'm just going to curve this around while holding it. You hear a nice definite snap, which hopefully you heard, I certainly did, and you know it's definitely in there. Now, just to be sure, I'll usually get a pick or a flat blade screwdriver and just sit there and make sure that it's definitely in, because what can sometimes happen, it tends to be more stereotypical of the C-type circlips, not the E ones, but the C ones, sometimes most of the circlip will be seated inside the circlip slot, but maybe the end of it or part of it is just sitting slightly out. And if that circlip comes out while the engine's running, it's game over for your engine. So very important that you just spend a little bit of time just making sure that it's definitely seated correctly, and we're not going to have any problems. Going to make sure that our rings are in the correct position, lined up with the ring pins. Yep. So again, there's the arrow. It's hidden by the oil. There it is. Arrow down. Get them in the right spot. And it goes. Happy days. Now what we want to do is make sure that the rings don't pop out beyond the skirt just here, because there you go, because they can actually pop out and get stuck. So we don't want that to happen. So we're just going to sit it as far out of the cylinder as we can, so we have nice access to that circlip slot when we're putting the bike together. So that's pretty much ready to slide onto the engine now. One thing I forgot to mention, the small end bearing. Now, because this bike has 26,000 Ks, I would probably just replace the small end bearing anyway, because for the sake of, I don't know, $20 or $30 or something for a small end bearing, yeah, it's worth changing, because if these do come apart, it's pretty much an engine detonation type situation. But this one here, all this black that's coming off this, that's not normal. And that's because water, it's gotten water all over it. Same as the piston had sort of black fluid all over it when I got it out. This one here, the old one, the same's happened here. Water's gotten on there, and it's just turned to this black sort of sooty rubbish, which oil wouldn't normally do. So I'm going to replace the small end bearing. Got a brand new one here, and exactly the same as everything else. We're just going to put some oil in it before we put it back in the bike. Really, really crucial. Don't want to dry small end bearing. All right, so we're in our engine. I'm going to try and get all of this on film, but no promises, because as I keep mentioning, the access on these is so terrible. It's often just a bit of a mission to get these parts in at all, let alone get a nice angle to film. So, brand new base gasket. There we go. Now, you could probably try and reuse the old one, but because they're a squash aluminium gasket, once it's sort of single use, so honestly, for the price of them, it's just not worth worrying about getting leaks when you can just put a new one in. They're so inexpensive. Right, and I didn't mention when we took it out, but Obviously with the Piaggio engine, we mentioned it before that they don't use a head gasket from factory. So obviously it's just one less gasket to worry about. Now I think I'm going to have to do the same thing. I'm going to have to tilt the back of the engine back, lift the back of the engine up to try and get this this cylinder on, because it's such an awkward angle. Okay, got it on. Just so awkward to try and do with the camera in the way. Grab our gudgeon pin. Now, obviously the eye of the crank, I want to try and line that up. It can be a bit of a pain. I usually do. Very gently get a screwdriver underneath and just try and use it to shift the crank so it's in the right position. I'm going to have to move my cylinder out very slightly. That's pretty good now. Now, if you're having trouble with this, just patience is the key. If you start forcing things, that's when things start to break. Okay, just going to wiggle it. You can also wiggle it by that. Oh, there it is. I felt it start to go in. Sometimes they just go straight in, sometimes they're a bit of a pain. Probably just caught up on the slot on the other end of the piston, so I'm just going to really gently tap it, being incredibly gentle. There we go. Just a little bit of shock force is all I needed. And make sure that the piston's as far out as it can come. Give me a bit more access. Let's give the straight needle nose pliers a crack, eh? No. I'm going to have to do it off camera, unfortunately. It's just too awkward with the camera there. Okay, I got it to sit in with the camera out of the way. Now this here is a fantastic example about of what I was talking about earlier. How the circuit can look like it's in, but it's actually in on one side and just sitting just outside of a little groove on the other side. So that's when you want to really hear that definitive click. And this is a really great example of that. So I just got my flat blade screwdriver here. I'm just going to give it a little push and we should hear a nice click. There we go. Very, very sure that's sitting perfectly in the groove. Happy days. Bit awkward, but we're in there. Everything's all fine now. Now you might be thinking to yourself, if water has gone into the carby, then it's gone into the crankcase as well. And you'd be absolutely correct in saying that. However, I'm going to pre-mix the fuel a little bit. We've got a fair bit of oil on the piston and inside that area. So there's not really a great way of cleaning any little skerricks of water out of the crankcase, because it was coming through the oil pump. It was quite a small amount. So what I'd rather do is just run the engine and let the fuel and the oil that's in there, I'm going to pre-mix a bit in the tank and let that flush, any little amounts of moisture that's left inside there out. I think that's going to be probably the best way of doing it, because it will flush out. And again, because it was just coming through the oil pump, it must have been such a small amount. It would have seized because of the lack of oil, not because of the tiny, tiny bit of water that was in there. We're going to chuck the head and the head studs on, and then I'm going to look at addressing this this oil situation. I think we've pretty much nearly drained the tank now. So I'm probably, what I'm going to do, instead of pulling the oil pump out, and is the two bolts that, 2 or 3, I can't remember exactly, that bolt the oil pump into the casing, they really commonly get seized because they're a steel bolt in aluminium. And they always get seized. Very frustrating to get them out, and I don't want to risk snapping the head off them or something like that and creating a way bigger problem than we need to create. So what I'm going to do, once I've drained the tank, I'm going to refill the oil tank with oil. I'm going to prime both of the oil lines, but I'm going to leave the small oil line, the sending oil line from the pump. I'm going to leave that off, and I'm going to run the engine, running the oil pump, until I see oil coming out of the other side. So I know that any water that's in the oil pump has been pushed out. Okay, let's get our head on. There's 2 different types of nuts. One of them is this long type, and the reason it's long is the thread in the end is used for the screw to go into for the shroud. Now this is important. The shroud needs to be there so that the airflow from the cooling fan is actually directed around the cylinder and isn't just free floating around. It's quite important. So these studs, I know because I've done it a million times, they go in the top left and the bottom right of the cylinder studs. Set that one on there, because these ones are long, they're often the easiest one to get in first. Especially on this particular model where access is a bit of a pain. Just going to sit those on. And I'm going to get our short ones on there. This bottom one is the worst one to get on. There we go, that's a couple of threads in. Okay, there we go, a bit easier. Okay, now with these head studs, you'll see in a second, what I'll usually do, head bolts, sorry, head nuts more accurately, is I'll use a small ratchet to do these up. Now the reason being, if you over tighten these steel studs, although they're going into the engine block's just aluminium. So if you over tighten them, you're going to give yourself a real headache. So I'll generally just use a small ratchet, usually a quarter drive, or in this case it's just a short 3/8, a double drive, and I'll use that to do it up. The reason being, you can't get anywhere near as much leverage on this as you can, say, for instance, a larger 3/8 ratchet, because I don't need to get a whole lot of leverage. You can get with this sort of thing, a better sense of feel with a small ratchet, because if you over tighten these and start ripping the stud through, you're in a world of drama. You're going to really badly damage your engine casing. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. Now, same as when you're doing the wheel nuts on your car, always use the cross pattern, because we want to keep the force nice and even. Be patient, it's not a race. Okay, head nuts are all on. I'm going to go ahead and put the cylinder shroud on now, because it's really hard to get the cylinder shroud on or off with the engine all the way in the bike. Once I've got that on, I'm going to put my engine bolt back through, and then we can have a look at sorting out this oil pump. So I've skipped a couple of steps. I've pretty much put everything back together. So exhaust is back on, got our spark plug and spark plug cap back in. Because the spark plug that was in it that I pulled out obviously been replaced by the customer trying to fix it, so there's no reason to replace that. I've put our Variator back together, and I've also, now that the oil tank is finished being drained, I've put some oil in it, and I've primed this oil line going to the oil pump. So what we're going to be doing here, I know that there's no water in the tank and there's no water in this line coming to the oil pump. The only place where there might still be water is inside the oil pump itself. So you'll see this little outlet up here. What I'm going to be doing, I'm going to just pop a screwdriver in the end of the starter pinion just to hold it in place. I'm going to start the bike up, just because that starter pinion can actually slip out and hit the outer pulley, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to hold that in place. I'm going to start the bike up without the cover on, and I'm just going to let it idle for a little while until I see the water work its way out of the pump, and I see it's just oil coming out. That way I know there's either very little or no oil left inside the pump. So once I've done that, I'm going to reinstall this oil line, which goes to the carby. I've mostly primed it, but you see a little bit of air in there because it's been sitting for about 20 minutes, so some of it sort of worked its way out. So I'll re-prime that, and then I'm going to reinstall that. Then we'll pretty much be ready to put everything back together for the final assembly, airbox and everything back on. And should be able to take it for a little test ride around the car park. Now, one extra thing I've done just with this sort of repair, just trying to eliminate any potential cause for problems later on. So, which we'd normally do with a piston rebuild, I've pre-mixed the tank. I've probably put a little bit more oil in the tank than what we would normally put in. And I've done this just in case there's still a little bit of oil or any air locks or air bubbles inside this oil system, because we've completely drained it. Or any little bits of water, like a little droplets of water still in there. I just don't want to risk the bike running even remotely dry again. So just by putting a little bit of oil in the fuel tank, we're just eliminating the potential for that being a problem, because I don't want to have to do all of this again. Okay, she's running now. I think it's probably because the airbox isn't on there. It's running a little bit lean. So I'll just turn the idle up. There's a bit of oil in there too, so it's probably a little bit rich on oil as well. So we'll let it run for a little while. I'll sort that pinion out, we'll let it run for a little while, get that water out. Hopefully you can see pretty clearly in that first shot the water coming out of the end of the oil pump, and by the time the second shot come around it's pretty much all oil. By the time I turn the bike off, because we're using a different colour oil that I've primed the line with compared to what was originally in the scooter, red to green, you can clearly see that that oil's worked its whole way through. Interestingly, in that second shot, I actually pulled the butterfly, the secondary throttle cable that goes to the oil pump to increase the oil pumping. That's what its job is. It increases the oil pumping when you turn the throttle. Quite a clever system. I pulled that cable all the way out to its maximum adjustment, so it would be pumping its maximum. And that's why you probably see in the second shot that the pulsing is a lot more powerful, and it's pulsing a lot more often as well, which very, very ingenious of Piaggio to use that butterfly system on their oil pumps. That's what we usually tell people. Sometimes people ask us, oh, should I run a premix on my scooter? Factory oil pumps are so effective at doing what they do, you really do not need to. You premixing your tank has no ability, the scooter has no ability to increase the oil amount compared to the fuel as you throttle up, whereas that oil pump can do that so effectively. It'll increase the oil the more revs you're doing, which is very, very clever. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and chuck the rest of this bike back together. It's going to be really boring to watch, so I'm not going to chuck it in the video, but we'll catch back up once everything's back together, and I think I'll take it for a quick burn around the car park, make sure everything's all good. With a repair this in depth, and particularly on a bike that has so many Ks, this bike has about 26,000 Ks, there's lots of little things that I've had to do, a lot of the maintenance items, things that have worn out, that I sort of skipped over. But one of them, we took it for a first test ride just before. I noticed it still just didn't feel right. It was quite boggy. So I popped the airbox apart, and the old air filter was crumbling apart. And a common issue with this air filter, but it's on these Sport City ones, it's also on the Zip. The air filter tends to shrink and squash and not sit in there properly. It tends to suck in, and it ends up blocking the airflow. So I've chucked a Molossi red sponge in this one. And I also jetted up slightly. It was at about a 62. I've gone to a 65. A lot of these things, with a bike this sort of age, there's often lots of little things that you need to do to get the bike running properly. But I'm pretty happy with this bike now. It's running really nicely. And let's take it for a little zip around the car park and show you. One fixed up scooty. Thanks for watching, guys. Look, hopefully there was some useful information in there for you that you can use on your scooter, or even if you have a friend's scooter you're helping out. Hopefully there's some stuff in there that you'll be able to apply to a build or a repair that you'll be doing in the future. Look, if you have any questions, guys, as always, please let us know. We endeavour to answer every single question in the comments. And thanks again for watching. We appreciate your support.